Welcome to the Harpe Bioherbicide podcast. I'm Dr. Alex Stanis, and in today's episode, we'll be speaking with Chairman of Harpe Bioherbicide, Aidan Connolly. Aidan has more than 3 decades of experience in the agribusiness sector. He not only leads the Harpe Board of Directors, but is also president of AgriTech Capital and serves as CEO of Cainthus, an Irish dairy technology startup. His work in over 100 countries, including directly with governments in the US, China, Europe, and Brazil, makes him an authority on today's topic, challenges that farmers are facing all over the world. If you could please introduce yourself and tell me a bit about your career trajectory to here.
I'm Aidan Connolly, president of AgriTech Capital. It's an LLC out of Wilmington, North Carolina. I provide advisory service for large agribusinesses and indeed food companies and sometimes governments. I help startups with investing, with raising investment, with their introducing them to potential partners and helping with the commercialization of their technology and other general advisory. I've also written 2 books. The most recent is called The Future of Agriculture, a free download from agritechcapital.com for those that wish to download it. It's been downloaded a few thousand times already, from over 110 countries. I write for Forbes as a frequent contributor there on their technology council, and I teach on 3 Agri MBA programs.
Fantastic. Can you tell me a little bit too about how you got interested in this industry? What brought you to agriculture?
Well, I was studying my MBA in Ireland, and then I joined an organization called Alltech, which was in Kentucky. So that grew while I was there from about $25 million turnover to $2.5 billion. I would not credit myself with that journey, but I was in the bus, and I learned a lot about how companies like that grow, what they do, what they need to do. And I suppose in a new world of what we call startups, innovation, digital disruption, different types of biological interventions, you see a lot of companies struggling with the same issues Alltech struggled with back in the 1990s. And it's been interesting for me to replay that experience, working in 100 countries, learning 5 languages, living in 7. Start to replay a lot of those experiences for companies as they set out in their journey, and hopefully guide them towards that same sort of level of success in the future.
Fantastic. Well, so you've had this sort of long experience in agriculture and in helping sort of guide these companies through that. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of where the agricultural industry stands right now? What are sort of the big challenges that ag is facing?
The big challenges are pretty well known to anybody who reads the newspapers. We are trying to produce food affordably, abundantly, and we're trying to do so sustainably, meaning leaving the planet in the same condition with which we when we started the process. And we're also getting requests from consumers, or what I sometimes like to call prosumers, that is consumers with a proactive approach to what they purchase. We're getting a lot of questions about animal welfare, climate change, about the treatment of workers, the treatment of data, what we're doing to increase the transparency, traceability. So these questions are difficult questions. They're difficult questions for any industry. They're a little more difficult for agriculture because we have been fabulously successful at the part I described first, which is safe, abundant, affordable food. Now we have to do other things, particularly for Western consumers. So I think those are the bigger challenges we're facing. It does make it a very exciting industry. It does mean that the levels of challenges we have are not simple to solve, but they're forcing us to embrace innovation and different types of disruption.
We're seeing these challenges in the agricultural industry. Can you tell me a little bit about how the industry is starting to face them? How is it starting to meet these challenges of balancing, both creating all this food and creating these things that are sustainable and sort of meeting these consumer demands? How do you tackle all those things at once?
With great difficulty, I suppose, is the easy answer. I think that the general answer has been to try to find new technologies that mirror older technologies, but fit with the new attributes. So business I was heavily involved in, livestock, we commonly found that in order to grow more meat, produce more milk, get more eggs, you put animals in confinement. And, nothing like what you see sometimes in the newspapers. It looks horrible. Nice houses, nice environment, very fresh air. But even so, we still found ourselves relying upon antibiotics to keep animals healthy and alive. Consumers said they didn't want it. We resorted to probiotics, prebiotics, enzymes, all of these kind of natural, I'll call them nutraceutical therapies, and those have functioned. Those have worked. We are now capable of producing chickens and milk and meat without the routine requirement for antibiotics. Same thing happening, obviously, with respect to fertilizer. We have not had the same level of success yet, but we're already seeing biologicals, bacteria of certain strains being used in soils and helping us to reduce the level of fertilizer required by 20-30%. Not the end of the journey, but still a nice way to start. And I could give example after example of where we're removing chemicals, removing different processes. Clearly, the consumer, for better or worse, is often in the end not willing to pay more. So you need to learn how to use new natural technologies with some of the mindset and knowledge of what we've done with the old technologies, but also understanding that consumers aren't necessarily going to pay a higher price. And so therefore we need to be very judicious in whatever we do to find the best technologies that really function in the best way.
In keeping exactly in that vein, the reason why we're talking today is around herbicides and thinking about sort of taking those strategies and bringing them to herbicides as well. Thinking of these natural technologies that will not cause the consumer to have to pay 3, 4, 5 times more for their produce or for their product. Can you tell me a little bit about, broadly first, what the agricultural industry is facing in terms of issues with herbicides? What are the problems with sort of weed removal and weed prevention?
Yeah, so herbicides, with my accent, I might call them herbicides at certain stages. So assume it's the same word. It's the same word. They are extremely effective and have done an extraordinary job. And we would not be feeding 8 billion people without Roundup and many of these other products. But I wrote a piece for Forbes called "Can You Imagine a World Without Roundup?" Are we ready for a world without Roundup? Playing on the Roundup Ready, of course. And the reality is today we probably aren't. We do have alternative chemicals, chemistry. Much of that has not been as effective. We get resistance. We are getting resistance to Roundup, particularly in the United States. But we do have weeds such as blackgrass that you find in Europe, which is increasingly a problem, and resistant to herbicides as well. We're finding that the ability to rotate, that is to use one and then use another, which traditionally would have been a way of increasing effectiveness, is being compromised by restrictions from governments, and indeed even from other activist groups, NGOs, etc., saying, no, we don't want you using that material. We don't want you to use it as frequently or as that high a dose, and Europe is leading the way in this respect. So we are facing a situation where we've restrictions on existing chemistry, we've got natural resistance occurring to the chemistry, and we have very, very few new options coming down the pipeline. Harpe was the one that I came across that I was really excited by, not just least because it's in North Carolina, close to where I am, and met the founders, but also because it seemed to respond to the needs that we've been talking about for the last 5 minutes.
Can you tell me how you came to meet sort of the people at Harpe? How did you get involved with the company and thinking about that sort of as an investment possibility?
Yeah, I met them pre-COVID, which means that I was able to meet them at a conference. I know conferences are returning, but I met them at a conference in London. We got to know each other pretty quickly. Obviously met up in Raleigh shortly after that. I worked with them on another project of another exciting product that was taking a little longer because it was a conventional product for, it was going to be used in the citrus industry, in the orange juice industry, and I was very excited by what they had. But one day we started talking about Harpe and what Harpe was. I of course showed my ignorance. I said, well, why would you call it harp? That sounds like a musical instrument. And explained that no, actually it was a sword being used by Perseus to cut off the hair of Medusa. And just like Medusa's hair, the ragweed, the weed that's resistant to, or pigweed is resistant to Roundup, is and other chemicals, is similar to the hair of Medusa. And I thought, well, that's very memorable. I won't forget. I won't have to ask that question again. So as we talked through what Harpe was, and I had come from, in my previous Alltech background, I had come from seeing natural products. I mean, we built a $2.5 billion company on the back of natural interventions backed by science. And as they decided to start to describe what they were doing, I mean, I was just very excited and said, I will have no problem at all in getting interested investors and getting people excited by that. You will have no problem in getting employees to join you, because that's a quintessential noble cause, helping farmers, helping the environment, and responding to responding to the prosumer concern.
So you've been involved now for a few years. How have you seen sort of the development of people getting interested in the product, people responding to the product? You had a very favorable outlook on it, it sounds, or sort of, potential for it. Has it sort of lived up to that in sort of pulling people in, talking about it, seeing how people respond to it?
It is not difficult to explain to people what Harpe is. It's not difficult to get them excited about how it can affect or change the world. It is something on an airplane or an elevator, when you say to them, these are natural compounds, naturally occurring compounds that with the science that the team is bringing are capable of killing weeds, and being used in conjunction with existing chemistry, or being used even in organic situations to replace existing chemistry. Everybody understands, what most people understand what, for example, Roundup is, and they understand what a natural alternative, even one that can work with Roundup, is. So from that perspective, I think selling people, telling people, exciting people about why this could change the world is not a difficult thing to do. What might have gone wrong the last 4 or 5 years since we had those meetings at the convention in London? Would the science stand up to it? And it does. Would the trials show the benefits? And they do. Are the trials being done in famous institutes, places that people will have confidence in? Are they being done by researchers who've got credibility? All of that is happening. The IP, the intellectual property, they already had a patent pending. Now they're building more and more patents around this area, looking at different ways in which it could be used with different plants, with different other organic compounds to make it penetrate the plant, so you get a systemic ability to control the weed, so it doesn't just simply die and grow back. All of those parts as you look along, and not least the team itself. And you see people like Bill Buckner, veteran of the industry, tremendously well versed in all of the challenges, but also extremely respected. His name, his reputation goes without saying. Our rocket scientist in Chad, who really has visions of the ways in which we can do things differently. Daniel, obviously a great communicator. And then the consultants, and not least the board of directors that we've assembled. I think that all the pieces have really gone extremely well. You never know. I've worked with a lot of startups that have done good things. Harpe are doing great things. That for me is the difference.
That's such a perfect summation. I love that. And I think, it is
so many startups really do try and do good things, but sometimes the science falters or something happens and the market changes. But it really does feel sort of poised right now that the science is working, the team is great in there. So where do you see this going? Where do you see sort of the future of ag? How does Harp fit into that portfolio?
I think exactly like you'd expect. So row crops, corn, beans, using Harp to control weeds. People whose lawns are kept nice and green in North Carolina, sometimes where it's quite difficult to do so. Sometimes I even see them trying to paint the grass to keep it green. But I know anybody who works in landscaping will tell you that they're constantly being asked by consumers, by their customers, to stop using chemicals, to stop using chemistry. I say, I know, Aidan, that this isn't the right thing, perhaps, but they want one outcome. The way I get there is through this. So obviously that's an ideal market to embrace this type of technology. When you go to organic fields of cotton, you go to organic fields of vegetables and not least flowers, increasingly, again, consumer pressure asking for those to be grown differently and weeds to be controlled differently. Harp just fits in. So I know I can never get the number right, whether this is a $10 billion market or it's a $50 billion market, but it's one of those numbers, depending on how broadly you define it. It's a massive, massive, massive need. And the market for herbicides has not been diminishing. It's been growing over time because you talked about what I call the two-headed consumer, buying organic and then wanting to buy it cheaply. At the same time, we see the same things of people wanting to have one world and yet also wanting it to be different. So Harp fits perfectly with that two-headed type of thinking because it actually fits. It fits with both. You can think with both your brains and you get the same answer.
That leads sort of perfectly into a couple of my wrap-up questions here. I mean, what do you think are the broader implications for the industry of switching to technologies like Harp? It's going to help kill weeds, of course, but do you see this as sort of a change that we're going to start thinking about how we just farm completely differently? Is it going to allow sort of more innovation in how different companies are thinking about creating herbicides, creating new chemistries? What do you think? What is this the first step towards?
I think there've been two buckets. There's been the natural bucket and there's been the traditional bucket. And I think we're increasingly understanding that you need to not demonize one side or the other and find ways to bring the two together in kind of a confluence of science and understanding what nature is capable of. We will be harnessing nature in a different way in the future. You see gene editing through CRISPR, and that's a very exciting technology for me. You see, different types of chemistry, particularly biochemistry being invented. And not least, we do see changes in terms of what we're getting in plants. Some of that, again, is editing the plants, but I'm even thinking about ways of growing different plants together at the same time, which digital technology, robotics, drones, sensors are allowing us to do, to look at not monocultures, but to look at polycultures. So you grow beans in a field together with a whole pile of other things, and you harvest them on different days because you can. So there's a lot of exciting things happening that I think will change the world of food production, and not least how we control weeds. The herbicides will be a major part of that. And I think we're going to see an acceleration of that. We're going to see more companies like Harp 10 years from now come out with more ideas in more different ways. Those are the directions we're taking. But Harp is the first, and as such, it will set a lot of the standards, I believe, of how these technologies are viewed, how they're used, and I believe their success will be a pathway, direction for others to take.
You touched on something there that I think the typical consumer might not be aware of. Can you give sort of someone who, goes to the grocery and buys food and maybe imagines that, it's coming from a farm of what it looked like 50, 60, 70 years ago. Can you actually just sort of give a picture of what the modern 2023 farm looks like?
Sure. I mean, obviously, it is. You do see organic farms, and you do see people picking by hand. The realities of once you get to larger scale are that you're contracting people in to pull weeds, to pick flowers, to pick vegetables, and it's backbreaking work. And there's a reason why in the United States you don't find any, let's call it, native US citizens choosing to take that as a career. But you don't find it in other countries either. Whichever country you go to, it tends to be done by immigrant labor. So that is being increasingly replaced, or at least looked at from robotic companies to see what they can do. If we think of farms that are growing in greenhouses, those greenhouses increasingly have sensors to measure in real time the uptake of water by the plant. They will irrigate using smarter irrigation systems, not least what they call micro irrigation. So you're irrigating directly droplets of water to the roots of the plant. You're using artificial intelligence platforms or informed platforms with all of the data to manage the heat, the sunlight, etc. There's great stories around the use of energy, so solar energy, hydrothermal energy, what can be done with wind power to try to drive those systems. We are seeing vertical farms. For me, vertical farms are still starting. They're not something which is a significant contributor to the food production of the world today, but undoubtedly we'll see more and more of that, particularly with the drive towards local, but also with water issues being such a problem around the world. Vertical farms definitely help us with maximizing the return on our water. So I know people call them factory farms. I don't like that phrase. I don't think it's appropriate, but definitely intensive. What we have to also remember is that when we see the smaller scale organic farms using manure, using labor, etc., not only are they a lot more expensive, but also they're not necessarily as safe. So the systems we have, these larger scale systems, produce food which does not make us sick through E. coli or salmonella, which controls heavy metals, other potential toxins within the system, and gives us traceability that if something happens, such as a freshness issue, you can use blockchain, etc., and go back to the source and get there quickly. So every aspect of things that you see being used from a digital disruption perspective are arriving into agriculture, and but particularly being embraced by larger farms. It's also interesting to me, I did this work on dairy. If you were to reduce the carbon footprint of the dairy industry, you would revert to a US model. And to reduce it, because efficient cows have a lower carbon footprint.
Right.
And even more so, if you got the most efficient cow that we've ever had, instead of, I think, 350 million cows, you'd only need 3 million. You literally could produce the same amount of milk and have 99% reduction in the carbon footprint of milk.
Wow.
It's not quite as dramatic in other businesses, but it is true that more efficient farms producing more wheat, more barley, more corn, and more beans have a lower environmental footprint than those that don't. And with the current consumer demands for that and for affordable, the only way to continue to run those systems effectively is to start thinking about innovations. Harpe happens to be one of those.
Perfect. That's great. Yeah, the sensor technology to me is always so fascinating that we can get, ideas of what's happening in the greenhouse, what's happening in the field, just remotely as it's happening in real time. Those kinds of things, in thinking about efficiency, just I think are so cool and so fascinating to think about how those are even just going to improve going forward. Well, with that, thank you so much for chatting with me today. It has been lovely speaking with you.
That wraps up this episode of the Harpe Bioherbicide podcast. Special thanks go out to Aidan Connolly and, of course, to our listeners. For more information on today's topic and Harpe Bioherbicide's mission to provide a new environmentally safe and sustainable approach to weed control, visit harpebio.com. I'm Dr. Alex Danis, and we'll see you next time.